Welcome. So I'll hand over in just 1 second, but what today, this session now is about today, is what I think is really interesting. When I was sat where you were sat a year ago, what I wanted to understand is what's working in the market. And I wanted to understand that because I wanted to sell. That's what I think we're all here for. We're here to make money. So the ladies from Bandwidth will hopefully enlighten us in that in the most up-to-date way with information from customers and the market. So over to you.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. Again, thank you so much, Nick. I am Caitlin, and we're going to talk a little bit more about use cases. So we've heard a lot today about discussions in the industry and ecosystem, and one of the things that we really want to make sure and bring is direct voice of customer. So the actual voice of customers is something that you'll hear today. We actually have some audio embedded within our presentation where we couldn't have the customers on stage today, but we're actually going to bring the voice and use cases to you directly. So again, Caitlin Long, Director of Commercial Product Management at Bandwidth. And Stephanie, you want to introduce yourself a little bit more?
Hi, good morning. Stephanie Lashley. I am the Senior Director of Product Operations and Industry Relations. For those of you who aren't familiar with Bandwidth, we sell global voice, messaging, and emergency services. And you are probably using Bandwidth without even knowing it. We power brands like Google, Microsoft Teams, just to name a few. So really excited to talk to you today. I think that the information that we have to share, as Caitlin mentioned, is coming directly from some of our customers. So thank you.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've been talking about on and off throughout the presentations this morning is messaging, SMS, MMS. We've talked a lot about RBM and RCS, and why aren't we talking about the new hotness, right? Why are we continuing to talk about SMS? And I think throughout some of the presentations you've seen, it remains incredibly relevant. It remains incredibly relevant because it continues to be a channel that engages customers like no other channel. So when we're looking at the engagement rates around SMS, you're seeing almost 100% open rates. You've got 36% click-through rates. You know, I used to be in marketing, and I know that email marketers would give arms and legs for those types of metrics. And so you have a higher propensity to buy. You have a higher engagement rate when you're actually looking at the customer experience and customer journey. And so when we're thinking about how to provide different communication modalities and leaning forward, we want to continue to make sure that the channels that we're working on today remain relevant, and we're continuing to ensure the trust and the integrity of the channel that we're talking about.
Yeah, so this is an incredibly interesting slide in my opinion. So basically, in 2022, compared to where we project to be in 2025, there'll be a 7.5 billion increase, which is 90% of mobile access. So 90% of the world will have mobile access in 2025.
I'll just let
It's
that
huge.
It's huge. It's huge, and it speaks specifically to the first use case that we're going to talk about, which is accessibility.
Yeah.
Because when you're looking at the actual access to online presence versus just having the access to a mobile phone and potentially some form of messaging, it's vastly different. And so first use case we're really going to talk through is accessibility, and the way in which messaging has shown demonstrably to increase accessibility, equity in the communication channel. And what better use case to talk about accessibility than education? And so Dean's List, one of our customers, sits in the education space, provides a student, parent, faculty engagement platform. And Matthew Robbins, who's the CEO of Dean's List, talked a little bit more to us about what messaging has done for his company and his customers, education recipients that he serves. So let's hear a little bit more from what Matthew has to say. Maybe?
Oh.
No? Is it going to work? I have my backups in my pocket. Murphy's Law, what can go wrong will.
So there's supposed to be an audio of the CEO from Dean's List talking about using SMS messaging. So instead, Caitlin is going to read it to us.
Messaging is frankly transformative
no, she's
in like
not.
the teacher, family, student relationship. Especially in the communities that we serve, internet penetration is lower. Even smartphone penetration is still a little bit lower than you might expect. So the idea that families have to download an app, follow instructions, get some sort of validation code or login or sign-up process to get linked to their student's account, all of those are barriers, and any one of can cause a family not to get all the way through and getting set up on some sort of communication medium. But the one thing that everybody has and that everybody is comfortable with is SMS.
Yeah, so I think that this use case is particularly interesting because, as we mentioned, this is an education platform. So this is marrying up teachers with parents who may not have English as their first language, or the language that the teacher is teaching as their first language. And so this platform actually translates that native language into 192 different languages. So for the first time, you have parents actually interacting directly with teachers. And in the past, they may have been in the dark. They may not have had the ability to communicate. And so every day they're getting some sort of information from their teacher about their child. And what's interesting is homework completion rates raised by 40%. So that direct teacher-parent engagement was huge, all through SMS.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We often think about SMS leveraging ROI for sales and marketing, and when you think about the additional use cases like increasing accessibility and the KPIs for this particular industry, right, increasing homework completion,
Right.
or just access to the ability to speak to a teacher.
Right.
So the rural school districts, having, my mother actually is a teacher, and when you go out into these rural communities, not all of these students have home internet access.
Right.
And so it's having the ability to maintain the form of communication, and then additionally leveraging the cool features that Dean's List offers to provide sort of the language accessibility
Right.
as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then we don't have an audio clip for this one, but another place where we've seen this resonate, also in the adult education space, so Numbler plays in the patient education space. And Awan Vera, the CEO of Numbler, he speaks a little bit more about how MMS specifically can add actually the rich communication element to that engagement piece. And so this is another place where, as we're talking about additional rich communication channels like RCS and others, what else is possible there?
Yeah, I think that when I was interacting with Juan, he said something very interesting. He said that SMS is the last mile of conversation or communication with their users. And so I think that, Nimbler and Dean's List, see it as a very important way to communicate with their users.
Lots of good.
Ooh, now we talk about the bad.
Everyone's favorite topic. The bad use cases. Are we ready to talk about the bad?
I think we're ready.
Yeah. One thing that I do think is interesting and worth mentioning, so when you and I were actually prepping for putting together the panel and the sort of the good use cases, there's very obvious and apparent industries and verticals and swim
Right.
lanes. And when we're shifting over into sort of quote unquote the bad, you don't necessarily
Yeah.
see that same trend, right?
Right. I wouldn't say that any specific vertical or use case specifically are bad. I think it's more how they're being used. And so I would even go so far as to say that shifting from using the word bad to misunderstood or misregistered.
Yeah, just poorly managed potentially. And so Stefan Heller, actually, we interviewed him on our podcast recently. So bandwidth, we recently started a State of Business Text Messaging podcast where we talk to industry leaders and various different people that sit in different places in the industry, just about challenges that are faced, best practices. It's just like a really good conversation. And we spoke to Stefan on just sort of best practices in general, and he touches on this topic a little bit. So
if you're getting into the messaging infrastructure and planning to aggregate and help people navigate through sending A to P messaging of any kind, irrespective of the message sender, you have a responsibility to make sure that you're not helping bad actors get into the system and do bad things. You want good messaging. You want the ecosystem to be as clean as possible, because that's what's going to encourage people to carry on using it.
Yeah, so I think that this kind of sets the stage for the proactive and preventative, but also once the campaign is running, that ongoing auditing or management to make sure that what was registered is actually what is being sent. And so, obviously following best practices, ensuring opt-in, ensuring opt-out every second to third message. Sometimes, according to the use case, it makes sense to include it every message. But that's kind of where we see preventative, proactive, know your customer, registration, and then on the flip side, once a campaign is running, making sure that there isn't campaign drift, that campaign still matches what was registered originally.
Yeah, and I think the staying ahead of, we've talked a lot about various types of fraud today through different presentations that you've heard, and I think that staying ahead of the curve is important, especially, again, as we're talking about simultaneously maintaining the integrity of the messaging channel, sort of the SMS piece, while also leaning forward into additional avenues and venues of A2P messaging, like potentially RCS and
Right.
RBM and other things that we would look at here.
Right.
And so one of the trends, for example, we've seen recently is trying to avoid filters through sending content via an image. So actually sending nefarious content via MMS messages, where you're actually sending sort of a phishing messages, but via an image, so that it's
Right.
avoiding the actual free text language detection models. And so it's really just, it's the twofold. It's the upfront KYC preventative piece, and then the ongoing auditing piece
Right.
to maintain. My favorite, the ugly. So it wouldn't have been as catchy had we called it the underserved, right? So the good, the bad, and the ugly, great movie, by the way. But the underserved use cases, I would say,
Right.
is that a better name?
I
Really?
do. I think that, as I mentioned, it's kind of like this misrepresented, misregistered type of situation where some of these use cases are falling into.
Yeah, and also just places where I think that the industry needs a little bit better structure, or potentially maybe we just need to figure out a way to serve some of these use cases a little bit better.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there's an opportunity for us to work together. After we hear from the CEO of Rectangle, we'll talk more about that, or the vice president of Rectangle.
Yeah, so Kim Howland, we also interviewed her on our podcast, and she talks specifically about Rectangle Health, who sits in the patient engagement provider space. And so let's hear about some of her specific challenges with regards to messaging.
So we spend a lot of time with our customers educating them on the difference between marketing and not marketing in healthcare, right? It can become a fine line, to your point, right? So, you may have a patient with, whatever disease, and you want to remind them they need to take their medication, but you have to do that in a non-drug specific way, so it doesn't fall into potentially being a marketing message, right? And so we advise our customers to really focus on the indication, or having those patients get materials that are very educational in nature, but it stimulates some sort of call to action, so that you can then have the more specific treatment-related conversations through a different modality.
Yeah, so I think that what she's saying is that when a campaign of this nature is registered, it may not always fall into the parameters or the template of registration because it does turn conversational in nature. So, obviously P2P is P2P. It's texting between individuals. It's finding out what's for dinner from, your spouse. A2P, a message from a business, there is an opportunity when that message from the business actually turns conversational. And so what she's saying is adding clarity or not talking about medication or anything that could trigger a shaft violation or a sub-zero. They have to be very specific about how they actually go about sending these messages.
Yeah, I think there's two things going on here, right? So there's the one where when we have these really well-known good use cases when we're thinking about how we can better serve like healthcare, for example, patient enablement, patient education, how are we creating potentially dedicated swim lanes,
Right.
I don't know, or tagging for these particular examples, because obviously there's a difference between, hey, want a cigarette? Or, hey, don't smoke. There's a difference.
Right.
It's when you're trying to follow up with your patient and engage, and the medication that you're taking is part of that.
Right.
And right now, sort of when we're thinking about how you're sort of avoiding the filters on that, it's avoiding those specific language, but trying to better enable patient education. And then the conversational piece, which you touched on, I know that we have a couple of UCAS providers here today as well as yesterday. I spoke with a couple, and the conversational is a challenge, I know, for the UCAS use case as well.
Right, in
specifically.
particular. So think about customers like Ring Central, for example, who power a platform used by employees or individuals to have conversations through the platform. So I think that, when we think about underserved, when we think about opportunities, it's really trying to figure out how do we drill down into those nuances, those differences. You've got kind of this one-size-fits-all registration and this templated approach to identify who is sending what they're sending, but I think we could go a little bit further and create this nuanced understanding of it's not really a one-size-fits-all. It's certain situations that are A to P, but they are also conversational.
Yeah, I think you hit on it right there, right? Is that it's conversational is hard to templatize. And so as we continue to maintain the equity of the messaging channel, the SMS channels that we're working with, as we lean forward into other channels, blessed A2P channels, like potentially RBM and RCS, I think it's something that we need to think about. And we don't have a great solution today. The industry hasn't really found the best solution yet, and so I think it's worthy of more conversation.
Yeah, it's an opportunity.
Yeah. Nick, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, many thoughts. One thing that really stuck out to me was campaign drift. I've not heard of that before. Could you just give us an
Yeah.
example of campaign drift?
So when a campaign is originally registered, say it's a marketing use case. Campaign drift is when that marketing campaign is then sent for a completely different situation.
Right.
So it could then turn fraudulent, it could then turn into a phishing scam, but what was originally registered is not what is actually being sent.
Interesting.
I think it's a worthy call. It's not always nefarious, right? I mean,
It doesn't have to be.
it's just-
Sometimes it is.
It often, sometimes, yeah. I think it's also just drifting away from the original intent, just through overall lack of management as well.
Yeah, we've seen that before, and I think there's another piece around campaign where people are just kind of receiving the same information over and over. I forget the terminology, but it's people get bored with the same information.
Exactly.
So you have to spice it up a bit and make it a bit different. So in a lot of those use cases, were those global type of users, or was it mainly based in one country, or how does that fit for you?
Yeah, so we had, there was one where we have the customers were global base. The education, actually, they serve sort of, they have global markets as well. A lot of US and Canada learnings. And so Bandwidth is in a position now where we are expanding, and we have rolling out global presence and for messaging, and have been globally present for voice. And so I think there's a lot of learnings that we have had in the US and Canada and the UK, for example, that we're looking and seeing sort of at a macro level are relevant to the individual new markets that we're going into as well.
And the interesting thing for me, if I understood correctly, there seemed very much a trend from interactive messaging today through SMS, but into more rich messaging. Would that be a fair summary? Is that where you're seeing your customers wanting to be?
I think so. I mean, I think someone hit on it earlier, right? It's really like the adoption piece that we've seen be the barrier for some of the rich messaging. I think that there is the desire to go there, and we've talked about that in several other sessions as well.
Yeah.
But I think that we can anticipate the same types of challenges. That's why it's like, yes, it's a new channel, but it's the same types of challenges I think that we're going to have to face when we're setting up the guardrails around what does A2P look like on these channels.
Yeah, I would say to your original question, we've seen a progression from SMS being the preferred deliverability method to MMS. So those rich videos and pictures are growing in demand with a lot of our customers.
But are incredibly price prohibitive, as was mentioned earlier. And so I think that the economies of scale potentially of RCS and WhatsApp are really attractive to those MMS customers as well.
Yeah, my experience as well, as a CPaaS seller, if you like, there had to be some sort of ROI, very clear ROI you had to give to the customer, otherwise they're happy to carry on with crappy open rates on email.
Exactly.
Okay, let's open it up to the floor. We've got a couple of minutes left before coffee. Any questions? One at the back there.
It's like the light of God in my eye.
Still not on. If you shout up a bit, I can probably relay it.
Just holler.
Mic 2, please.
There it is.
Thank
Okay.
you. My name is Greg. I thought the conversational comment was very interesting and a little bit surprising coming from the healthcare industry in one of your examples, which is so regulated. We've definitely seen that in the sort of long tail. I'm thinking, for example, of a use case where we had sort of a beauty salon with a cannabis treatment or something, and they were trying to text about it. So the question to you is, do you see that as an issue that really differs by segment or other issues in general with A2P compliance by segment, or is it really across the board?
I would say it's across the board. I would say it isn't vertical or use case specific. Would you have something to add?
Yeah, if you're thinking about when you're talking about segment, if you're thinking about industry segment.
Or end size of business, perhaps?
Yeah. I think that there are particular challenges as you move across verticals, but just in general, it's harder to templatize. It's more fraught. I mean, obviously, the conversational element. There are places where there are more opportunities for fraud and sort of nefarious behavior to slip in, and so that's one of the reasons why it's harder to kind of wrap best practices around. But yes, it's kind of across the board, which is why I think elevating some of the better places where maybe we could lean in a little bit more and say, we know that this channel, this vertical, this industry sort of, let's maybe take it segment by segment and see if there's something that we can do from that approach, which I don't think we've really done yet as an industry.
Okay, thank you.
Hi there. My name's Michael from Mobile Ecosystem Forum. Great use cases. I love the case studies and the move from traditional marketing and sort of sales-based into things that actually make a real difference to parents in the case of the education one. But you really did hit on a potentially a problem there in markets like the US, which is so regulated. When we have a conversational platform, and I mean that was ripe for rich messaging, right? Where we can have call to action buttons to say your kid's not going to come into school or homework's being done. There's so many great use cases, but if we sort of change that into a theme that every conversation can have an upsell or a cross-sell, how do we deal with that with like US regulation? I think you started touching on it, but does that not create potentially a real problem when the human involved in that conversation can go off-piste and turn the conversation into a sales pitch? Or do we have to train the users of these platforms to be really careful what they talk about when they're talking to an end user?
Well, I think there's an opportunity to make sure that the content is compliant, but in terms of using SMS in situations that could meld into a sales pitch, I think you're buying a car and you're texting back and forth with that auto dealership. And so there may be an opportunity for Caitlin to be upsold or sold something, but that's kind of, she knows that going in because she wants to interact with that car dealer.
Yeah, I mean, I think think about it, we're all in here users as well, individual users and consumers of these channels, and so take ourselves out of the actual like regulatory and framework for a second and just think about like customer experience. And when I'm going out and trying to buy a brand shiny new Ford Bronco and I'm interacting with a CRM platform, which is an A2P channel, but it's actually it's just Frank on the other end of the line, and Frank is just going back and forth with me, and I want to continue to receive conversations, and it's a very specific model that I'm looking for, and so it may be 2 weeks at a time before he texts me back and says, actually, hey, it looks like we may have one in our dealer network, and I don't want to have to opt back in, for example, to receive that communication channel, and it's a continuous like conversation that we're having, and so I think it's continuous content monitoring, but then also making sure that we're figuring out the best way to manage if I do want to opt out. You can do that, but it's disruptive to the process, right? To continue to try and say, yes, I want to receive these conversations, or like it has to follow this exact template every time, because at that point, it's not me having a conversation with Frank through this channel. It's not conversational anymore, which is kind of the whole point of the appeal.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
It's not really an answer, but it's a non-answer answer.
No, I think
I think you touched on a great point there around the consumer, and I don't think as an industry we necessarily look at the consumer enough. And I think that could be a whole another couple of days. Digging into the data. So maybe we'll put that on the agenda for another MEF session. But our time is up. It's time for coffee. You'll say, thank goodness. Inject yourselves with a bit of life. So we'll be back in around 25 minutes. Just to finally say thanks again to Caitlin and Stephanie from Bandwidth. They have a very small booth amongst others here if you want to come and chat to them. I'm sure they would welcome that. So thanks again.
Thanks so much.